Leave that poor woman alone. The mountain man fought. 3 men who bullying the obese girl. The autumn wind swept through the narrow streets of Independence, Missouri, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. It was 1847, and the town bustled with trappers, traders, and settlers preparing for journeys west. Among them stood Silas Blackwood, a mountain man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. Silas had spent the better part of 20 years in the Rockies, trapping beaver and living alone in the vast wilderness. His face bore the marks of countless winters, weathered skin, a thick black beard streaked with gray, and eyes that held the depth of mountain lakes. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a deer across and hands scarred from years of survival. He had come to Independence to trade his furs and resupply before heading back to his cabin in the high country. The trading post sat at the corner of Main Street, a rough-hewn building that smelled of leather, tobacco, and dried meat. Silas had just finished negotiating a fair price for his beaver pelts when he heard the commotion outside. At first, he paid it no mind. Frontier towns were always full of noise and conflict. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of cruel laughter mixed with a woman's frightened voice. "Please, just let me pass," the woman said, her voice trembling but trying to maintain dignity. "Oh, we'll let you pass, fatty," a man's voice sneered, "soon as you pay the toll for taking up half the street." More laughter erupted, harsh and mocking. Silas set down the supplies he'd been examining and moved toward the door. Through the dusty window, he could see 3 men surrounding a young woman near the water trough. She was heavy-set, her simple dress straining at the seams, and she clutched a basket of what looked like laundry against her chest like a shield. The 3 men were typical frontier ruffians, unwashed, drunk even at midday, and looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. The tallest one, a rail-thin man with a patchy beard, kept circling the woman while his companions blocked her escape routes. "Come on, boys," the tall one said, reaching for the woman's basket. "Let's see what the fat girl's carrying. Maybe she's got some food hidden in there. Lord knows she eats enough." The woman jerked the basket away, and several pieces of clothing fell into the mud. Her face flushed red, not just from embarrassment, but from anger and humiliation. Silas could see tears forming in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. "That's my employer's laundry," she said firmly, despite her voice shaking. "You have no right to—" "No right?" The second man, stocky and mean-looking, stepped closer. "We got every right, sweetheart. This here's a public street, and you're blocking it with your considerable presence." The third man, young and stupid-looking, laughed so hard he nearly fell over. "Considerable presence. That's a good one, Jake." Silas had seen enough. He pushed through the trading post door with such force that it banged against the wall. The sound caused everyone in the street to turn and look. He stood there for a moment, letting his presence register, a mountain of a man with cold eyes and a hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. "The lady asked you to let her pass," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Seems to me that's a reasonable request." The tall ruffian, whose name was apparently Jake, sized up Silas with the false confidence of a drunk who hadn't yet learned to fear the right things. "This ain't your concern, mountain man. Why don't you head back to your hole in the rocks?" "I'm making it my concern," Silas replied, walking forward with measured steps. Each footfall seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet street. "Now step aside and let the lady go about her business." The stocky one, emboldened by whiskey and stupidity, moved to block Silas's path. "Or what? You gonna fight all 3 of us over some fat washerwoman?" The woman flinched at the insult, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She bent to gather her fallen laundry from the mud, her hands shaking. That simple, defeated gesture, the way she tried to salvage her employer's clothing while fighting back sobs, was what pushed Silas past the point of negotiation. "Leave that poor woman alone," he roared, his voice carrying the full weight of 20 years of surviving in the wilderness. It was a sound that had frightened bears and warned off hostile tribes, and it had its effect on the three ruffians. For a moment, they hesitated, but only for a moment. Jake, either braver or drunker than his companions, decided to press his luck. "Big man with a big voice," he sneered, pulling a knife from his belt. "Let's see if you're as tough as you sound." Silas didn't bother with words. When Jake lunged forward with the knife, Silas moved with the speed and efficiency of a man who'd fought grizzly bears and mountain lions. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, grabbed Jake's wrist, and twisted it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and before Jake could react, Silas's massive fist connected with his jaw. The sound was like a butcher's cleaver hitting wood. Jake crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. The stocky man and the young one stared at their fallen companion, then at Silas, then at each other. Some silent communication passed between them, and they both rushed Silas at once. It was a foolish move born of panic rather than strategy. Silas caught the stocky man's punch in mid-swing, his hand engulfing the other man's fist completely. With his free hand, he delivered a crushing blow to the man's solar plexus. The stocky man doubled over, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Silas shoved him aside and turned to face the young one. The young ruffian had grabbed a piece of wood from a nearby wagon and swung it at Silas's head. Silas ducked under the swing and came up close, too close for the young man to use his makeshift weapon effectively. He grabbed the boy, and he was barely more than a boy, Silas realized, by the front of his shirt and lifted him clean off the ground. "You picked the wrong woman to torment," Silas growled, his face inches from the terrified youth. "And the wrong day to do it." He set the young man down hard, then delivered a punch to his gut that sent him sprawling into the water trough. The boy came up sputtering and coughing, all the fight gone out of him. The stocky man was still on his knees, struggling to breathe, and Jake remained unconscious in the dirt. The entire fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. Silas turned to the woman, who stood frozen with her basket clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with shock. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25 or 26. She had a round, pleasant face with large brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress, though strained and mended in places, was clean and well kept despite the muddy laundry. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Silas asked, his voice gentle now, all the fury gone from it. She shook her head mutely, still staring at him as if he were some kind of apparition. Around them, a crowd had gathered, but no one spoke. The violence had been too swift, too decisive. "Let me help you with that," Silas said, bending to pick up the remaining pieces of laundry that had fallen. He gathered them carefully, shaking off the worst of the mud, and placed them gently back in her basket. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper. Thank you." "No need for thanks," Silas replied. "Those boys needed to learn some manners." He glanced at the three ruffians, Jake still unconscious, the stocky one gasping, and the young one dripping wet and miserable. "I expect they've learned them now." The woman looked down at her basket, then back at Silas. "I should go. Mrs. Cartwright will be wondering what took me so long." "I'll walk with you," Silas offered. "Make sure there's no more trouble." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, then nodded. "Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house is just 2 streets over." They walked in silence at first, the crowd parting before them. Silas could hear whispers following in their wake, but he paid them no mind. He'd learned long ago that people would always talk, and their opinions mattered less than mountain snow in spring. "My name is Martha," the woman said quietly as they turned onto a quieter street. "Martha Hendricks." "Silas Blackwood," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "You're a mountain man," Martha observed. It wasn't a question. "Have been for near 20 years now. Came down to trade my furs and get supplies." "Will you be staying long in Independence?" Silas shrugged. "Plan to head back to the mountains in a few days. Nothing to keep me here." Martha fell silent again, and Silas thought that would be the end of their conversation. They approached a well-maintained boarding house with fresh paint and flower boxes in the windows. She stopped and turned to face him. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice stronger now, though her cheeks were still flushed. "I want you to know that what you did back there, it meant more to me than you might realize. People don't usually—" She paused, struggling with the words. "They don't usually stand up for people like me." Silas felt a knot of anger tighten in his chest, not at Martha, but at a world that had taught her to expect such treatment. "People like you deserve standing up for just as much as anyone else," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Martha's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed different somehow, not tears of humiliation, but of something else. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. "Would you—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Would you like to come inside? Mrs. Cartwright always has coffee on, and I'm sure she'd want to thank you properly." Silas started to decline. He wasn't much for social niceties, and boarding houses full of chattering people made him uncomfortable. But something in Martha's expression stopped him. She wasn't just being polite. She genuinely wanted him to accept. And after what she'd been through, he figured the least he could do was sit for a cup of coffee. "That would be kind," he said. Martha's face lit up with a smile that transformed her features. It was, Silas thought, a lovely smile, open and genuine and free of guile. She led him up the steps and into the boarding house. Mrs. Cartwright turned out to be a bustling woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. When Martha explained what had happened, the older woman's expression darkened with fury. "Those Miller boys again," she spat. "They've been terrorizing this town for months, and the marshal does nothing about it. Says they're just high-spirited." She turned to Silas, looking him up and down with an appraising eye. "You gave them what they deserved, Mr. Blackwood. This town owes you a debt." "No debt," Silas said uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing," Mrs. Cartwright snorted. "Well, sit yourself down and have some coffee and pie. Martha, you get cleaned up and then come join us." Over coffee and surprisingly good apple pie, Silas learned more about Martha's life. She'd come to Independence 3 years ago after her parents died of fever. With no other family and limited options, she'd found work as a laundress and general helper at Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house. The pay was modest, but Mrs. Cartwright was kind, and the work was honest. "She's the hardest worker I've ever had," Mrs. Cartwright said proudly when Martha left to fetch more coffee. "Up before dawn, works until dark, and never complains. Those idiots who bother her don't see past her appearance to the good person underneath. Their loss, I say." When Martha returned, Silas found himself asking her questions about her life, her interests, what she thought of the town. He wasn't usually much for conversation, but something about Martha put him at ease. She was intelligent and thoughtful, with a quiet wit that emerged once she relaxed. She told him about her love of reading, though books were scarce and expensive. She described the garden she was trying to cultivate behind the boarding house, and how she hoped to someday have a place of her own where she could grow vegetables and flowers. "Sounds like you'd like the mountains," Silas found himself saying. "There's more peace and beauty up there than a body can take in sometimes, and the garden my mother used to keep when I was a boy." He paused, surprised by the memory. He rarely thought about his childhood anymore. She could grow anything. Said it was about understanding what each plant needed and giving it the right care. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Martha said softly. "She was," Silas agreed. "Been gone 20 years now, but I still remember her lessons." The afternoon stretched into evening, and Silas found himself reluctant to leave. It had been so long since he'd had a real conversation with anyone, since he'd felt connected. The mountain solitude that had once been his salvation now seemed tinged with loneliness. When he finally rose to go, Martha walked him to the door. "Will you come back?" she asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, if you're staying in town for a few more days." "I'd like that," Silas said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. He did come back the next day and the day after that. Each visit, he and Martha talked more easily, finding common ground in unexpected places. She told him about the books she'd read, adventure stories mostly, tales of exploration and frontier life. He told her about his years in the mountains, the harsh winters and spectacular summers, the wildlife and the solitude. On the third day, as they sat in Mrs. Cartwright's garden while Martha worked on her mending, Silas made a decision that both terrified and exhilarated him. "Martha," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know I'm not much to look at, rough and wild and more comfortable with bears than people, but these past few days they've meant something to me." Martha's hands stilled on the fabric she was mending. She looked up at him with those large brown eyes, waiting. "The mountain cabin where I live," Silas continued. "It's not fancy, but it's solid and warm. There's a creek nearby and good soil for a garden. It's beautiful country, Martha, peaceful and wild and free." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is, would you consider coming there with me, as my wife?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Silas's heart pounded in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since his first encounter with a grizzly bear all those years ago. Martha set down her mending, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Blackwood, Silas, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he urged quietly. "Say you'll take a chance on a rough mountain man who'll spend every day trying to make you happy." "Why me?" Martha asked, and he could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. "Why would you want someone like me when you could have—" "Someone like you?" Silas interrupted, his voice intense. "You mean someone who's kind and strong and braver than she knows? Someone who gets up every day and works hard and treats people with respect, even when they don't deserve it? Someone who can talk about books and gardens and make me laugh for the first time in years?" He leaned forward, holding her gaze. "Martha, I see you. Not what those fools on the street see, but who you really are. And what I see is someone I'd be honored to share my life with." Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Every word." "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was small and simple, held in the local church with Mrs. Cartwright and a few of her boarders as witnesses. Martha wore a new dress that Mrs. Cartwright had sewn for her, simple but beautiful, in a deep blue that brought out her eyes. Silas had cleaned up as much as a mountain man could, trimming his beard and buying new clothes that didn't smell of wood smoke and leather. As they stood before the minister, Silas looked at Martha and saw not just his bride, but his future. He saw years of shared meals and quiet conversations, of working side by side in the garden, of reading aloud by the fire on winter nights. He saw a partner who would share his life in the mountains, who would help him build something more than just survival. And when they said their vows, his voice was steady and sure. They left Independence a week later, their wagon loaded with supplies and the few possessions Martha wanted to bring. Mrs. Cartwright had wept as she said goodbye, making Martha promise to write and visit when she could. The older woman had pulled Silas aside before they left. "You treat her right," she'd said fiercely. "That girl deserves all the happiness in the world." "I intend to give it to her," Silas had replied solemnly. The journey to his cabin took 12 days of hard travel through increasingly rough terrain. Martha never complained, though Silas could see the journey was difficult for her. At night, they camped under the stars, and he showed her constellations he'd learned to navigate by. During the day, he pointed out landmarks and wildlife, teaching her the ways of the wilderness. "It's different than I imagined," Martha said one evening as they sat by their campfire. "Bigger somehow, more beautiful." "Wait until you see the valley where the cabin sits," Silas told her. "Come spring, it's covered in wildflowers, colors you wouldn't believe." When they finally reached the cabin, Martha stood looking at it for a long moment. It was indeed solid and well-built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows, luxuries Silas had traded for over the years. The creek he'd mentioned bubbled nearby, and the valley spread out before them like a promise. "It's perfect," Martha said simply. That first winter was an adjustment for both of them. Martha learned to manage the wood stove, to preserve meat and vegetables, to recognize the signs of changing weather. Silas learned to share his space, to consider another person's needs, to talk through his days instead of spending them in silence. But they also learned each other's rhythms and preferences. Martha discovered that Silas liked to sit by the window in the early morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Silas learned that Martha hummed while she worked, soft melodies that filled the cabin with warmth. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, working through the books Martha had brought and discovering new stories together. And slowly, carefully, they built a life. Spring came, and with it, the wild flowers Silas had promised. Martha planted her garden in the rich soil near the creek, and under her care, it flourished. They added a small addition to the cabin for storage and a workspace for Martha. Silas trapped and hunted, and Martha learned to prepare the pelts and preserve the meat. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Martha took Silas's hand. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else did, for standing up for me that day in Independence, for asking me to share this life with you." She squeezed his hand. "For loving me." Silas looked at his wife, strong, capable, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with what society valued. "Martha, you've got that backwards. You're the one who saved me. I was just existing up here, surviving. You taught me how to live again." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. In the valley below, an owl called out, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sounds that had once marked Silas's solitude now felt like a chorus celebrating their shared happiness. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked. "Leaving civilization, living up here so far from everything?" Silas considered the question seriously. "There are things I miss sometimes," he admitted. "But this," he gestured at the valley, the cabin, and finally at Martha herself. "This is worth more than all the civilization in the world." Years would pass, and their life would continue in that mountain valley. There would be challenges, harsh winters, lean times, the constant work of survival. But there would also be joy, quiet mornings, shared laughter, the satisfaction of a work well done. They would build something together that neither could have built alone. A home not just of logs and stone, but of mutual respect, companionship, and love. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Martha would remember that day in Independence, the cruelty of those 3 men, the fear she'd felt, and the mountain man who'd stepped forward and changed her life forever. She would remember his words, "Leave that poor woman alone." Words that had been spoken in anger at injustice, but that had led to something neither of them had expected. Silas, too, would remember. He'd remember the tears in Martha's eyes, the dignity with which she'd held herself despite being tormented, and the moment he'd decided that some things, some people, were worth fighting for. He'd spent 20 years learning to survive alone in the wilderness, but it had taken one courageous woman to teach him that survival wasn't the same as living, and that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection. Their story would become part of local legend, the mountain man and the woman he'd defended, who'd found love in unlikely circumstances and built a life in the high country. But for Silas and Martha, it was simply their story, as natural and right as the mountains themselves. And in that cabin in the valley, surrounded by the wilderness they'd both come to love, they lived out their days in contentment, proving that worth isn't measured by appearance or society's narrow judgments, but by the courage to live authentically and the wisdom to recognize true value when it appears.